the blue wave comes in November. Democrats all across the country will be winning lots of races, potentially taking over the United States House, potentially the United States Senate, and cleaning up even when it comes to gubernatorial elections. One of the big reasons for that, African Americans, especially black women, turning out in huge numbers. People are registering left and right, but what's happening is Republicans are continuing massive voter suppression efforts. In Georgia, where Stacey Abrams is running for governor on the Democratic side, she is facing against Brian Kemp, who is the Georgia Secretary of State, who wants to be the next governor. Yet as Secretary of State, he is the one who is over the elections there as well. Atlanta TV station WSB is reporting that requests from African-American voters for absentee ballots in Georgia are coming in at a rate not seen since President Barack Obama was elected in 2008. But Kemp is trying to deny folks. What he's actually doing is he's holding them up and somehow challenging them. This is what the Associated Press reported about Kemp's exact match rules, meaning that just missing a middle initial can put the registration on hold. Quote, an analysis of the records obtained by the Associated Press reveals racial disparity in the process. Georgia's population is approximately 32% African American, according to the U.S. Census, but the list of voter registrations on hold with Kemp's office is nearly 70% black. Not only that, people are not being notified if there is a problem, so you have to check to see if you are registered. Folks, what in the hell is going on there in Georgia? These are some of the things that Republicans are doing all across the country. In fact, in Missouri, a federal judge slapped down the Secretary of State in Missouri who put out some misleading ads literally saying that voters in Missouri needed their voter ID to vote. That is not the case. In the Supreme Court, they've also upheld a voter ID bill in North Dakota that many say will actually hurt Native Americans. Why? Because in North Dakota, they require you to have a physical address and not use a P.O. box. Well, those Native Americans who live on reservations, they don't have those addresses. They're using P.O. boxes. So several thousand Native Americans may not be able to vote in November as a result of the Supreme Court holding up this particular issue. And so we're seeing this. Why does that matter? Because you've got a critical U.S. Senate race that's happening there as well. Folks, what we are seeing again are Republicans across the country continuing to try to shave off the number of votes, denying people the opportunity to vote. I want to go to my panel right now. Joseph Williams, senior editor for U.S. News and World Report. Barbara Arnwine, founder and president of the Transformative Justice League. Dr. Cleo Monago, a socio-political analyst and activist. Joseph, I want to go to you first. Again, we're seeing what Republicans have done since Obama was elected in 2008. We saw it in North Carolina, in Mississippi, in Texas, in Florida, in Alabama. Now we're seeing it in Georgia. We're seeing it in Missouri. We're seeing it in North Dakota. They want to deny people the opportunity to vote.
Well, it's not a surprise, actually. You talk about how it went back to President Obama. It goes back even further than that. Carol Anderson, an academic at Emory University, wrote a book about it where she talks about how this voter suppression campaign stretches all the way back to the 1890s in Reconstruction. In Mississippi in particular is where the genesis of it has happened. And it has taken place constantly from then until now. You had poll taxes then. Now you have voter ID laws. You had count the number of bowls on a bar of soap then. Now you have to get a driver's license, a birth certificate, or a passport to even think about registering, and they're not going to tell you, they're not going to help you. So this is part of a continuum. It reached an apex under Obama with the Shelby County decision, and now these are just additional measures to try to push it even further because we all know every vote counts.
And Barbara, because what we're seeing, to Joseph's point, because the Supreme Court made that particular ruling, when it came to Shelby v. Holder, those states are no longer required to do preclearance. So they can do anything they want when it comes to changing their voting procedures, and they don't have to worry about the Department of Justice weighing in.
Because you have Jeff Sessions as the Attorney General, and everybody be very clear, that whole act that you saw happening with Lindsey Graham in South Carolina is because he is on deck to become the next Attorney General after the midterm elections. So we got to be very clear that when it comes to the Department of Justice, there is no justice to be found for African Americans seeking equality at the voting place, seeking no non-discriminatory voting rights. So what I want everyone to remember, is that it's not just the Supreme Court. In 2011, I unveiled the map of shame that showed all the states, over 40 states at that point, that were entertaining some kind of form of voter suppression measure. It's because in 2010, 25 million people who voted in 2008 did not vote midterm. That's why people need to know that the midterm elections are critical, Roland.
Cleo, again, we have seen the games Republicans have played for a long time. And again, what they desperately need is to shrink the electorate, shave off several thousand votes because they are afraid that America is becoming more black and brown.
Well, what concerns me is that, as you just said, they were doing it a long time. And my question keeps being, why don't we anticipate this and do what we can to block the likes of Kemp in terms of his activity much before the election, knowing how the Republicans can operate? Stacey is doing really well in Georgia. I mean, everywhere you drive around, her signs are up, and they're really, really nervous because they usually control it on the state level. So we should expect this. George Bush did this in Ohio, in the Midwest. This is not a surprise. What are we going to do going forward and immediately to prevent this, to anticipate knowing what they always do?
Well, here's what needs to happen is what State Representative Alicia Reese is trying to do in Ohio. Change the state constitution to have a voter bill of rights as opposed to every 2 or 4 years trying to go to the courts to change these things. We're seeing the ballot initiative in Florida. That's about polling at about 72% to give formerly incarcerated folks the right to vote. She has been desperate to get Democrats, to get progressives, to get these billionaires to fund this initiative because it's already been certified. If they can get the 330,000 signatures needed to put on the petitions, get it certified, they can put it on the ballot. Unless we begin to say, fine, the Supreme Court not going to do their part. If you change the state constitutions, Barbara, and I know that's expensive, I know it's difficult, but if you change the state constitutions and you put in the state constitutions the affirmative right to vote, which does not exist in the U.S. Constitution, then we're not dealing with these same games being played by Republicans.
And absolutely. And that fight is not only, in Ohio and other states, but Michigan. They have Promote the Vote, where they are pushing, for their state constitution and for their legislative requirements, greater access to the ballot box. These are, our efforts. When you were talking about and you mentioned the absentee voting flood that is happening in Georgia, that is activists on the ground. I've been working with them who are doing that work. They're having what they call pews to the polls. So they're at churches where people are filling out their absentee ballots and they're helping people to make sure they do them right and get them in the mail. So we know that our fight right now is against, all of this voter suppression, but it's for better, voting rights, including automatic voter registration. If you have AVR, as 13 states do, mostly white states, predominantly white states, but if you had automatic voter registration, 90% of your problems go away. So that's, one of the big things. Same-day voter registration is absolutely key. Online voter registration right now, just think about it. Yesterday, 15 states closed out their voter registration. And of that 15, 4 people had almost zero options on the last day because all they could do is try to download a form and put it in the mail. It had to be postmarked that day. But people who had online voter registration could register all the way up until 11:59 p.m. That's what we're talking about. We're talking about really changing the dynamic where people don't see this as just an election electoral battle, that we create permanent infrastructure where our whole battle is 24/7, 365 days a week, where our children don't only go to church and just attend, something called Bible study, but they do freedom school study, so they know what it means to vote and why the vote is so important to our freedom.
But what, if anything, on a policy level can, like the Congressional Black Caucus, do in terms of a policy to minimize these interruptions of a democratic process?
They can't, because the problem here is that by the Supreme Court and Shelby B. Holder pretty much gutting this Voting Rights Act, you no longer have the pre-clearance requirements. The Congressional Black Caucus can't do anything because you have a Republican, Sensenbrenner, who is from Wisconsin. Even though he has a bill many CBC members don't like, he at least is saying, the Supreme Court said Congress needs to fix the formula because it's outdated. Sensenbrenner, Republican, put forth a bill. He had about 10 or 12 co-sponsors 2 Congresses ago. This current Congress, he's got 3 or 4. So Republicans are like, we don't want this. They have no effort. You have Bob Goodlatte of Virginia, who chairs a House Judiciary Committee, does not want to call any hearings. You don't see the Senate Judiciary calling any hearings. Republicans don't want to change the Voting Rights Act. They don't want to improve it. And so since that's the case, we cannot depend on the Supreme Court. We can't depend on Republicans in Congress. The only way to go about this, we're going to have to go state by state. And frankly, we don't have to even target all 50 states. What you do is you target the states with the highest concentration of black voters, and you put it in the Constitution. And Joseph, real simple, white folks aren't going to vote against guaranteeing the right to vote in the Constitution, because these voter suppression efforts are impacting elderly white people, like in Wisconsin, young white voters, like in Wisconsin and North Carolina as well.
And women, they are lumped in oftentimes with people who have struggled to maintain access to the vote. What you're saying, Roland, is 100% correct. You can't depend on Congress at this moment. Until things flip, nothing's going to change. The second thing is you have a very real threat in Supreme Court Justice Brett Kavanaugh, who, with Supreme Court Chief Justice John Roberts, both worked together in justice departments to repress the vote under Nixon and under Bush and under Reagan to a degree. So what you also have now are volunteer squads that are going state to state to register people who help them get the documents that they need, help them get the kind of access to the polls that you're talking about. The problem here also, it's a great setup, but the problem here is money. And that's one of the things that Republicans are depending on, is the fact that this has to be a volunteer effort. This has to be an effort outside of government, and it's going to cost a lot of money.
One of the reasons why...
Again, let me explain to everybody who's watching, because you might be saying, oh, it's all emotional. No. A federal panel found that in North Carolina, Republicans in North Carolina had a laser-like focus on black voters. They were specifically asked in emails, when are African Americans voting in early voting? 70% of African Americans in North Carolina voted the first week of early voting. So what did they do? Got rid of all of the early voting locations during the first couple of weeks, and they only had 1 location open in each county. Guess who copied that? Ohio. Other states saw it. So what Republicans are doing, Barbara, and I got about 45 seconds before I go to the next topic. What Republicans are doing is that they are finding, they're threading that needle. They're finding the legal ways to shave off 5,000, 10,000, 15, 20, 30, 40,000. And then all of a sudden you look up, we know from the studies, upwards of 200,000 people in Wisconsin were impacted by their voter ID. And in the last election, a federal judge called in Governor Scott Walker, even though the Obama Department of Justice okayed their voter ID and said, why are you dragging your feet issuing voter IDs? So even though they got the law approved by DOJ, they still were dragging their feet in delivering the IDs because they did not want those folks to vote. Barbara, final comment before I go to the next topic.
Yes, and the most important thing for us to know is that you can only win, as Reverend Jesse Jackson says, if you fight. And the reality is that we have been overcoming and beating them at this game when we organize, when we fight, when we turn out, when our churches do what they need to do, when our civic groups need what they need to do, when everybody who's listening does and watching does what you need to do. This is our fight. This is our moment. This is our time. We got to seize the moment.